imagine walking into like an ancient settlement. You approach it, and the very first thing you see is this massive, meticulously constructed stone tower just rising ominously above the landscape.
Oh, yeah, a really imposing structure.
Right. And you see these elaborate, incredibly thick defensive walls. And then you walk inside the settlement itself, and you find these intricate water management systems, like massive tanks designed to hold huge reserves.
And a ton of people, right.
Exactly. A bustling population of, thousands of people. They're working, they're living, they're defending their property. It essentially has all the hallmarks, all the physical trappings of what you and I would intuitively just call a thriving society.
You'd think so, definitely.
But according to historians, you are actually not looking at a civilization. And that, to me, just begs this massive, totally mind-bending question, like, why not?
It really completely upends our intuitive checklist, doesn't it?
It really does.
Because, we tend to think of human progress as this straight line, a simple accumulation of technology. A certain number of bricks get laid, a certain population density is reached, and boom.
Like a video game achievement.
Right, exactly. If you build the tower, you get the civilization badge. But the actual reality of how humanity crossed that threshold is, it's far more elusive. And frankly, I think far more fascinating.
I completely agree. And finding that threshold, really understanding the exact mechanics of that leap is exactly the mission of our deep dive today.
It's a huge topic.
It is. And if you're listening to this, I know you are the kind of person who really wants to get under the hood of history. You don't want just like the dates and the names of the pottery styles.
Right. You want the actual mechanisms.
Yeah, you want to know the why and the how. What actually drives human behavior. So today, we are looking at this roughly 3,000-year window that permanently altered the trajectory of a world that, structurally speaking, had already been modern for like 10,000 years.
And to do this, we are pulling from a really highly dense, incredibly insightful stack of sources.
We got some great stuff today.
We really do. We have an excerpt titled "04 Early Civilized Life," which kind of charts the historiography and the origins of civilization. And alongside that text, we are examining a deeply detailed map of the Fertile Crescent.
Which is going to be huge for us later.
Oh, absolutely. We'll use it to literally track the physical movement of these ancient peoples. And finally, we have this visual anchor for our discussion, which is the cover of The Penguin History of the World, the 6th edition.
Right, by J.M. Roberts and Odd Arne Westad.
Right.
I actually have to spend a second on this cover because it is just breathtaking. It kind of sets the philosophical tone for everything we are about to talk about.
It's a very striking image.
It really is. It features this sprawling, almost impossibly intricate oil painting of the Tower of Babel.
Oh, yeah.
You're looking at this massive, multi-tiered, spiraling architectural behemoth. It seems to defy gravity.
Yeah.
And it's swarming with like thousands of tiny human figures.
Just crawling all over it.
Yeah, workers, foremen, priests, they're all hauling materials, operating these rudimentary cranes, just toiling away to build this monument up into the clouds. It is this portrait of absolute hubris, but also, and this is key, a portrait of staggering cooperation.
And there's that little detail in the corner, too.
Oh, right. Right down in the corner, the publisher's logo is on there. A little drawn penguin, which is just, a delightfully absurd contrast to the sheer crushing weight of human ambition happening in the painting.
It's so funny. But, that cover image really is the perfect metaphor.
Let's hope.
Well, the mythological Tower of Babel represents this explosion of human complexity, this massive cooperative effort, and ultimately the diversification of humanity, which, as we'll see today, are the exact hallmarks of the transition we are dissecting.
Right, right.
But before we can actually build the tower, we kind of have to look at the ground it was built on.
Okay, yeah. Setting the stage, the text talks about this climatic prerequisite, right? It makes a really crucial point about what the world looked like 10,000 years ago.
It does. If we wind the clock back to about 8,000 BC, the physical shape of the world was basically what it is today.
Really? Like exactly the same?
Pretty much. The outlines of the continents, the major natural barriers like the Himalayas or the Alps, the oceans, they were broadly set. We are talking about the period right after hundreds of millennia of these incredibly violent planetary upheavals from the last ice age.
No.
Glaciers advancing and retreating, sea levels just drastically rising and falling. And then suddenly, by comparison, the Earth just took a breath. The climate stabilized.
Let's actually unpack the mechanics of that.
No.
Because I think We often picture ancient history as this perpetually chaotic, geologically volatile time, volcanoes erupting everywhere constantly.
Like a disaster movie.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what the source text makes explicitly clear is that for this short window of time, the grand planetary scale chaos had essentially paused.
Yes. From this point onward, as the historian in our text points out, we only really have to look at short-term, localized fluctuations in climate. The massive epochal shifts were just over.
So it's kind of like the difference between being on a ship in a Category 5 hurricane versus just, navigating through some choppy local currents.
That is a great way to put it. The environment was finally predictable enough that you could actually plan for tomorrow.
And for you listening, I really want you to think about what that means fundamentally for the human psyche. That brief window of stability was the blank canvas humanity desperately needed.
It really was.
Because up until this point, the Earth was dictating literally everything to us. If the glaciers moved, well, we moved. If the Ice Age killed off the megafauna, we had to completely change our diets. We were entirely reactive.
Always on the defensive against nature.
Right. But from here on out, as the text so profoundly notes, most major changes to the physical world would be man-made. Civilization is basically the mechanism by which humanity transitioned from being a passenger on Earth to being its primary terraformer.
It is a massive, profound shift in agency, but the question that naturally follows, and it's the one that stumps so many people who look at this era, is this. If the climate was stable 10,000 years ago and the canvas was finally blank, why didn't civilization just immediately pop into existence everywhere at once?
Right. Which brings us right back to our opening image. To answer that, we have to travel to ancient Jericho, because it's the ultimate paradox. It's like the perfect case study for what civilization is not.
Jericho is such a fascinating mirror to hold up to our modern assumptions.
The source material gives us some incredibly granular details about it. Geographically, it sits on an oasis that is fed by a never-failing spring.
Which is huge.
Right. Because of that incredibly reliable water source in what is otherwise a really harsh environment, people have lived there on and off for about 10,000 years. It's just an absolute magnet for human settlement.
But it gets a lot more complex than just, a few nomadic tents clustered around a watering hole.
Much more complex. The text points out that in late prehistoric times, farmers really clustered around this spring and the population just swelled. We are talking about a permanent settlement of between 2,000 and 3,000 people.
That's a lot of mouths to feed.
It is. And furthermore, long before 6000 BC, they had engineered and built these great water tanks.
Which heavily suggests, real foresight and provision for massive needs. That was almost certainly for irrigation for agriculture.
Right, because you don't build massive stone tanks just so you can get a drink of water.
No, you build them to control the environment, to ensure your crops actually survive the dry season.
Exactly. And if that wasn't enough to impress you, they had elaborate physical defenses that were kept in that for a very long time, including that massive stone tower I mentioned at the start of the deep dive.
Yeah, that tower is wild.
They clearly had property. They had something of immense value that they believed was really worth defending with their lives and their intense labor.
It was, by any prehistoric standard, a very considerable, totally formidable place.
So for the listener, I want to use an analogy here to kind of ground this. I want you to imagine Jericho like a really highly funded modern tech startup.
Okay, I like this.
You walk into their headquarters in Silicon Valley, and it just looks incredible. They've got the gorgeous glass office building. They have state-of-the-art espresso machines everywhere, a massive security team at the front desk, and thousands of employees just buzzing around.
You'd look at that physical infrastructure and immediately say, wow, this is a fully realized, successful, world-changing company.
Right. You'd think they've totally made it. But there is a fatal flaw in the operation.
They haven't actually launched a self-sustaining product yet.
Bingo. They are just burning through their initial venture capital, which in Jericho's case is that never-failing spring. They have all the physical trappings of success. They have the big architecture and the massive headcount. But the underlying engine of actual innovation isn't quite there yet.
And that's why, as our source text explicitly states, for all its water tanks and massive stone towers, Jericho was not the beginning of civilization.
Which is such a tough pill to swallow for anyone, relying on a simple physical checklist to define history.
I have to admit, I was completely thrown when I first read that, too.
Yeah. I mean, right. Thousands of people. Monumental stone architecture requiring immense organized labor, complex water management systems. If that is not civilized, what in the world is?
And it wasn't just Jericho that fell short of the mark either. The text actually mentions several other almost civilizations.
Yeah, there's Satolhuk in modern-day Turkey. They had extensive brick building and this really dense urban layout happening around 6000 BC.
And the text notes that by 5000 BC, all across Western and Eastern Asia, there were scattered farming villages that were producing significant agricultural surpluses.
They were leaving behind evidence of highly complex religious practices, too.
Yes, and they were manufacturing elaborate painted pottery, which the text points out is one of the most widespread and varied art forms of the whole Neolithic era.
So we have art, we have surplus food, we have religion, and we have density.
We have all the pieces.
Right. I'm looking at this list and just scratching my head. What is missing? Why does the historical community look at these massive human achievements and just say, nope, not a civilization yet?
Well, to really understand that, we have to wade into the historiography a bit. The study of how history itself is written and defined. We have to look at how we even define the word civilization.
Right, the dictionary definition.
Yeah, our source text takes direct, completely unapologetic aim at the Oxford English Dictionary's definition here.
Oh, let me actually read it. So the OED defines civilization as a developed or advanced state of human society.
I mean, it sounds incredibly official and authoritative, doesn't it?
It sounds great until you think about it for 2 seconds.
Exactly. As the author of our text argues, it is so cautious, so incredibly vague, that it's entirely useless as an analytical tool.
Because it just completely begs the question. It's circular logic.
Precisely. What does advanced actually mean?
Right.
How far developed do you have to be? Developed along what specific lines? Are you advanced just because you build really tall towers, or are you advanced because you live in perfect harmony with nature without building anything at all?
It's so subjective. The text actually compares it to trying to define an educated person.
Right. Yes. Everyone intuitively thinks they can spot an educated person when they speak to one. But a university degree isn't an infallible indicator of an educated mind, and no two people will perfectly agree on what constitutes a truly educated person.
I love that we are digging into the biases of the dictionary here, because honestly, whoever wrote that definition at Oxford was probably just picturing a 19th century European city as the pinnacle of advanced and then working completely backward from there.
That's a very likely, yes.
So if we throw out the dictionary, and if having a massive stone tower and 3,000 people isn't civilization, what is the actual tipping point? Because I think the listener and I are both struggling to see where the line is actually drawn.
Well, what's fascinating here is that the author explicitly warns us against looking for a single physical test.
Okay.
We can't just say, oh, once they have writing, it's a civilization, or once they build a pyramid, it's a civilization.
Yeah.
Instead, we have to look at what all undisputed, historically agreed upon civilizations actually have in common. And the magic word, the absolute key to this entire era, is complexity.
Complexity. So not just size.
Exactly. It's not just having a lot of people living next to each other or building a really thick wall to keep invaders out. It is about reaching a level of internal elaboration that allows for a radically new level of variety in human action and experience.
Variety.
Yes, it is the interaction of human beings in a highly creative, highly specialized way.
Okay, let's unpack that mechanism a bit. Variety in human action.
So, think about a well-off primitive community. Let's say they are fantastic farmers. They have a massive surplus of grain. But culturally, practically, most people in that village are still doing roughly the exact same things every single day.
Right.
They wake up, they tend to fields, they repair their own homes, they make their own clothes, they go to sleep. The roles are incredibly limited. So the society is wealthy in calories, but it's poor in variety.
They are essentially a monoculture of human experience.
Right. But civilization happens when a critical mass of cultural potential and a surplus of resources are built up to such a degree that it literally releases human capacities at a totally new level.
So to bring back the startup analogy really quick, Jericho had the venture capital, the water, and they had the nice office space. But every single employee was still just doing generic data entry.
Yes, exactly.
Civilization is when the company finally generates enough steady revenue that they can stop everyone from doing data entry. They can hire a dedicated marketing team, an R&D department, an HR staff, and a visionary CEO.
That is exactly it. And the text says that, in large measure, the development that follows this division of labor is self-sustaining.
That's the engine the startup was missing. Civilization is basically a chain reaction that feeds itself. The complexity generates new challenges, which then require new specializations, which then generate even more complexity.
It's an unstoppable feedback loop.
Yeah.
Once it starts, it accelerates.
So if complexity is the spark, right, if this self-sustaining chain reaction is the defining feature of civilization, where does that spark actually catch fire? Because it clearly didn't happen out in the open fields.
No, I didn't.
According to our sources, the ultimate incubator for this complexity is the city.
And that connection isn't just historical. It is built right into the very DNA of our language.
Oh, the Latin roots, right.
Yes. Our modern English word civilization shares its exact Latin roots with urbanization.
Right, civis.
Civis, meaning citizen or townsman, and civitas, meaning city. Bringing people together in a large, dense agglomerations fundamentally, permanently changes the human scale of things.
It's not just a really dense pattern of agricultural villages clustered around a local market anymore. It becomes a fundamentally different beast. But let's get into the mechanics of that again. What actually happens inside the walls of the city that makes it this incubator?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is entirely about the reallocation of wealth.
Okay.
Let's walk step by step through the chain reaction that the text provides. Inside the city's sphere of influence, agriculture produces a massive surplus of wealth, meaning way more grain than the farmers can actually eat themselves. But instead of everyone just eating bigger meals or, hoarding that extra food in their own personal huts for a rainy day, that surplus is centrally collected. And that makes totally new things possible.
So if they aren't just eating the surplus, I'm assuming they're trading it for exotic weapons or using it to pay laborers to build better walls.
Well, they eventually do those things, definitely. But the biggest initial sink for that surplus, the mechanism that first really drives this reallocation, is actually religion.
Wow, religion.
Yes, it provides for the upkeep of a priestly class.
Which means for the first time in human history, you now have a group of adult humans whose full-time state-sponsored job is not acquiring food.
Exactly. And that priestly class, completely freed from the burden of subsistence farming, has the time and the mandate to elaborate a highly complex religious structure.
Because they have all day to think about it.
Right. And that structure, in turn, demands the construction of great buildings. Buildings that have far more than merely economic or defensive functions. We aren't just building silos to hold grain or walls to block arrows anymore.
Oh, no.
We are building massive temples to connect with the divine.
Like the incredibly massive, intricate structure we see on the cover of the Penguin History of the World, the Tower of Babel.
Precisely. That painting captures the exact moment surplus is translated into monumental architecture. But the chain reaction doesn't just stop there.
Right, it keeps going.
This new complexity, this urgent need to manage the massive surplus, to track which farmer gave what to the temple, to record the increasingly complex religious rituals, it pushes human cognition to its absolute limits. Human memory is no longer sufficient to run the society.
So they literally have to invent a prosthesis for memory.
Exactly. The priests need to track the grain. So they invent simple tally marks pressed into wet clay. Those tally marks gradually become more sophisticated to represent different goods. Eventually, they realize those marks can represent the sounds of words, not just the physical objects.
That is so cool.
And suddenly, accounting gives birth to writing. The text notes that this eventually leads to the writing down of literature itself.
That honestly blew my mind. Writing wasn't invented by poets trying to capture the beauty of a sunset. It was invented by ancient accountants trying to make sure the temple got its fair share of barley.
It's very pragmatic.
Extremely pragmatic. But the ultimate result is that resources are being permanently allocated away from immediate consumption and into what the text brilliantly calls storing enterprise and experience in new forms.
That stored culture, whether it's in a clay tablet, a stone monument, or a codified set of laws, becomes a tool. It is a more and more effective instrument for changing the world. You don't have to relearn everything your ancestors knew from scratch. You can just read their tablets and start from where they left off.
For you listening right now, I really want you to think about your own daily life. Think about your job or your community. Unless you are a literal subsistence farmer growing every single calorie you consume, the very fact that you can specialize, that you can be a software engineer, a barista, a graphic designer, a nurse, stems directly in an unbroken line from this ancient reallocation of resources.
It absolutely does.
Your highly specialized modern job is the direct descendant of that ancient priestly class. It is the luxury of variety that the city provides.
It is the ultimate modern manifestation of that complexity we were just talking about. The city provides the density, the friction, and the surplus required for humanity to diversify its efforts.
All right, so we've got the formula identified. It's a stable climate, plus an agricultural surplus, plus the dense resource reallocating environment of the city, leading to a critical mass of complexity.
That's the recipe.
Now, here is where the history gets really contentious. Did this magic formula get unlocked by one genius group of people in one specific place, and then just spread out across the globe? Or did it happen spontaneously and independently in different places?
Oh, this raises one of the most important questions in all of historiography. It's a question that historians have debated fiercely for over a century.
And to really answer it, we have to look at the timetable of beginnings provided in the text. Let's lay out the chronology of when the lights turned on around the world. The text actually states that civilization began at least 7 distinct times.
7 independent occasions where that specific mix of human skills and natural facts came together to create a totally new order of life based on exploiting nature.
And they all fell within roughly a 3,000-year span, which the text astutely notes is barely a blink of an eye compared to the vast, incredibly slow scale of prehistory.
It's incredibly fast, historically speaking.
Yeah. But importantly, they were not simultaneous. Let's walk through the timeline. We start with the first recognizable civilization appearing in Mesopotamia in the Middle East, somewhere in the 4th millennium BC, roughly 3500 BC.
Okay, and next, the lights turn on in Egypt, observable just a bit later, perhaps around 3100 BC.
Then we jump westward over to the Mediterranean, where the Minoan civilization appears on the island of Crete about 1,000 years later, around 2000 BC.
Meanwhile, much further east, another civilization appears in the Indus Valley in India around 2500 BC, and the text notes it is to some degree literate.
Then China's first civilization starts a bit after 2000 BC, and much later still, the civilizations of the Americas, the Mesoamericans, finally arrive on the scene.
Right.
Now here's where it gets really interesting, and where my brain immediately started jumping to conclusions when I read this.
Oh, I bet.
When I look at that map of the Fertile Crescent, I see Mesopotamia and Egypt relatively close to each other. They're connected by trade routes. I see the Mediterranean Sea connecting the Levant to the Minoans in Crete. It is so incredibly tempting to look at that map and think, Egypt and Crete just copied the Mesopotamians.
It makes sense intuitively.
It totally does. Was there just one central source, a single intellectual virus that spread across the globe?
You're touching on what's known in historical circles as the diffusion theory. And I really want to emphasize that for a very long time, this wasn't just some fringe idea. It was the dominant, universally accepted paradigm of history.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. Because to your exact point, there is solid archaeological evidence that Egypt and the Indus Valley were in touch with Mesopotamia very early on. Trade goods have actually been found. So it was a highly logical leap for 19th and early 20th century historians to assume a single common civilizing source.
Let's dig into why they believed that, because the historiography here is fascinating. Why were historians so eager to believe in a single source?
Well, it stemmed largely from a pretty heavy bias of the era. Many early historians simply could not fathom that ancient, quote-unquote, primitive humans were capable of independently inventing something as complex as writing or monumental architecture multiple times.
Oh, wow.
They basically believed human invention was incredibly rare. Therefore, they thought there must have been one single genius civilization, usually assumed to be in the Middle East or Egypt, and that all other civilizations were just degraded copies, spreading outward like ripples in a pond. They even called it the light from the east model.
But our expert text pushes back on this hard. It says the diffusion theory is dead.
It completely dismantles it. The diffusion theory has been utterly discredited in modern times for a few massive, undeniable reasons. And first and foremost is the revolution of radiocarbon dating.
Let's actually explain how that works, because it's the weapon that killed the theory.
Sure. Before the 1950s, historians had to date things relatively. They would look at a style of pottery in Europe, see that it looked vaguely like pottery in Egypt, and just assume the Europeans copied the Egyptians later on.
Based entirely on vibes.
Basically. But radiocarbon dating allowed scientists to measure the decay of carbon-14 in organic materials, which gave them an absolute date, a hard number.
And when they tested the dates, the math didn't work for the diffusion theory.
Exactly. Suddenly, they realized that the megalithic tombs in Western Europe were actually built before the pyramids in Egypt.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the ripples in the pond were moving in the wrong direction, or they were appearing simultaneously without any contact. As we acquired more knowledge of early chronology, the timetable of this supposed uniform spread just fell completely apart.
The timelines shattered the theory. But the text provides an even more fatal blow to the diffusion theory, and that is the Americas.
The Mesoamericans are the ultimate proof of independent human ingenuity.
Yes. The text notes that once we get past about 1500 BC, only the Mesoamerican civilization is sufficiently isolated for interaction not to be a big part of explaining what happens.
Right, they were entirely cut off from the rest of the civilized world by two massive oceans.
They didn't get the memo from Mesopotamia. They didn't trade with Egypt. They had no idea the wheel or cuneiform existed, and yet, entirely on their own, they still built a massive, complex civilization.
Which proves definitively that civilization wasn't just a single intellectual export. It was a latent potential within the human species itself. Something humans could manifest independently given the right environmental pressures and the right internal organization.
But that leads directly to another fascinating point made in the text.
Right.
Because they developed independently, because they didn't share a single blueprint, civilization is not some standard tech tree in a video game that every society climbs in the exact same order.
That's a brilliant way to conceptualize it. The idea of a standard universal pattern of social evolution is just as discredited as diffusion. We don't all go from stone to bronze to iron to writing in lockstep.
The text gives us some mind-blowing examples of this uneven, jagged distribution of skills. Like the Mesoamericans, who were entirely isolated, carried out major building operations. We were talking about awe-inspiring, monumental architecture, massive pyramids, without the use of draft animals or the wheel.
I want you to really pause and imagine the sheer human effort, the entirely different logistical thinking, the unique social organization that requires.
Let's say.
To move multi-ton blocks of stone through a dense jungle without a cart or an ox, it requires a completely different mechanism of society than what was happening in Egypt.
And on the flip side of the technological spectrum, the text notes that the Chinese knew how to cast iron nearly 1,500 years before Europeans figured it out.
We also see massive variations in communication and administration. Some civilizations had complex writing systems, which the text notes is incredibly useful for storing and using experience, but other highly complex societies existed without it.
Right.
They relied on incredibly sophisticated oral traditions or mnemonic devices, like the Incan quipu, which used knotted strings to record data.
So if they aren't following the same blueprint, and they aren't all sprouting in the exact same environment. I mean, earlier we talked about river valleys, right? Mesopotamia had the Tigris and Euphrates, Egypt had the Nile, India had the Indus, China had the Yellow River.
Yes, the classic river valley theory.
Right. They all had these rich, easily cultivated soils in river valleys that could support dense populations. But the text points out that this isn't a universal rule either.
No, it's not. The river valley is a great catalyst, but civilization also arose away from river valleys. The text explicitly mentions Mesoamerica, which was largely jungle and highland, and Minoan Crete, which was a rocky island entirely reliant on maritime trade, and, later on Greece.
So what is the real catalyst then? If it's not always a river, and it's not a copied idea from a neighboring empire?
The author suggests the most satisfactory answer is a really complex combination of factors. Yes, a favorable geographical setting is essential. You absolutely must have the ability somehow to generate an agricultural surplus. But another factor is just as important and perhaps much more elusive to historians.
It's even element.
Exactly. It's the capacity of the specific peoples on the spot to take advantage of an environment or to rise to a unique challenge. Different environments, different external influences, and entirely different cultural inheritances meant that humanity did not move at the same pace, use the same tools, or even aim toward the same goals.
So we have these 7 distinct starts. They vary wildly in technology, they utilize completely different environments, and they aim at radically different societal goals. What did this actually do to humanity as a whole?
It resulted in what we might call the Great Divergence.
Let's unpack this section of the text because I think this is one of the most counterintuitive, brilliant insights in the entire source material. The coming of civilization actually made us radically different from one another.
It is the paradox of variety.
Right.
The most obvious glaring fact about early civilizations is that they are startlingly different in style. But as the author points out, because it is so incredibly obvious, we usually just completely overlook it.
For you listening, I want you to think about our modern world to understand why this is so profound. Today, ever since the 20th century, the rise to global dominance of Western technology has been making the world look exactly the same everywhere you go.
Oh, completely.
You can fly across the globe, from Tokyo to New York to Dubai, and you see the exact same glass skyscrapers, people staring at the same smartphones, drinking from the same international coffee chains, wearing the same mass-produced clothing. Modern technology is an aggressively homogenizing force. It essentially erases difference.
But early civilization did the exact opposite.
Yes, the text explicitly states that the coming of civilization opened an era of ever more rapid differentiation. Dress, architecture, technology, behavior, social forms, religious thought, it all diverged rapidly.
To give a concrete example of this divergence, contrast the civilization of ancient Egypt with the Minoan civilization on Crete.
Okay, let's do it.
Egypt was built around the terrifying predictability of the Nile River. Their society was rigid, eternal, focused on massive defensive deserts and monumental stone pyramids. They were built for a god-king to ensure the afterlife. Their architecture screams permanence and unyielding order.
And the Minoans.
The Minoans were on an island. They were maritime traders. Their survival depended not on a single river, but on navigating the unpredictable sea and trading with diverse neighbors. Consequently, their palaces at Knossos weren't massive, rigid fortresses.
What were they?
They were these sprawling, unfortified, labyrinthine complexes filled with vibrant frescoes of dolphins and acrobats leaping over bulls. Their society was fluid, merchant-driven, and entirely different in spirit from Egypt. Civilization didn't make them identical. It gave them the tools to express their unique environmental and cultural realities in spectacularly different ways.
Now, to be fair to the text, it does note that the roots of this variety lie deep in prehistory. There were already early humans with different lifestyles, different physical characteristics, and different mentalities long before cities.
Right, definitely.
But previously, those differences were merely the product of natural endowment and environment. You wore furs because it was cold. You had darker skin to protect from the sun.
But with civilization, that variety was now the product of the creative power of human agency itself. Civilization became a factory for alternative models of society. From these first civilizations up to our own day, there have always been alternative models available, even if those societies knew little or nothing of one another.
Which brings up a very serious structural challenge for anyone trying to study or understand this period.
Yeah.
We are looking at these radically alternative ancient models through the lens of our own modern, highly homogenized, hyper-rational culture.
And the expert text gives us a severe warning here. It warns against the ultimate trap of history, which is anachronism.
Let's lean into the historiography again here. This is crucial for the listener.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of how we understand the past, we have to realize just how hard, perhaps impossible it is, to recover the inner life of the mind from back then. We have their physical institutions, we have their art symbols, and we have ideas embodied in their early literature. But hidden within all of those artifacts are unstated presuppositions.
The text beautifully phrases it as the great coordinates around which a view of the world is built.
Yes. Think about how a modern person views time. We view time as a straight line moving from the past through the present into a future of continuous progress. That is a fundamental coordinate of our worldview. But many ancient civilizations viewed time as circular, an endless repetition of seasons and cosmic cycles.
And the text points out that the people holding those views often didn't even know those presuppositions were there. They didn't debate whether time was circular. To them, it was just the unquestionable reality of the universe. The text has this brilliant, profound line. History is often the discovery of what people did not know about themselves.
I love that line.
I had to stop and read that sentence 3 times. It's incredible. History is often the discovery of what people did not know about themselves.
It means we can look back and see the invisible structures dictating their lives, the reliance on a fragile climate, their geographic bottlenecks, that they themselves were completely blind to. But conversely, many of their most deeply held ancient ideas are simply irrecoverable to us.
It's a huge barrier.
It is. We have to make a constant, exhausting effort of imagination to avoid falling into anachronism, which basically means assuming they thought like us or projecting our modern values, our logic, or our motivations onto their actions.
Even when they had early literacy, The text explicitly warns that reading their accounting tablets or their myths doesn't actually reveal very much of the inner minds of creatures that are so like and yet so unlike ourselves. I think that's the perfect way to phrase it. We are looking at aliens who just happen to be our great-grandparents.
Indeed. We cannot assume an ancient Babylonian merchant was motivated by the same kind of rational profit maximization as a Wall Street trader. Their world was populated by angry gods, circular time, and entirely different definitions of value.
To really see this rapid differentiation, this collision of alien worldviews in action, without projecting our own modern biases, we have to zoom in on a specific physical location. We need to look at the most volatile, innovative, and chaotic transit zone in early history.
We need to turn to the map.
Let's do it. Let's look at the map of the Fertile Crescent provided in our sources. If civilization requires this delicate pressure cooker balance of stable climate, agricultural surplus, and intense human interaction, there had to be a specific place on Earth where this environment existed in the extreme. If you haven't seen this map, let me just paint it for you.
It is the ultimate geographic checkpoint.
It's a sweeping, bright green curve of heavily settled land. It starts down at the Persian Gulf, stretching northwest up the valleys of the mighty Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This is Mesopotamia. On the map, you can see ancient legendary cities dotted like jewels along these rivers. Ur and Uruk near the Gulf, moving up to Assur and Mari.
Then the crescent curves westward, across the land, reaching toward the Mediterranean coast.
Right, it hits the coast and sweeps over cities like Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, Damascus, and Jerusalem, and then it hooks southward, acting as a land bridge right down into Egypt and along the lifeblood of the Nile. It's this massive arcing corridor of life.
But what makes it a pressure cooker isn't just the fertile land, it's what surrounds it. It is bracketed by some incredibly imposing, unforgiving geography.
It's really trapped.
Yeah, to the north you have the Black and Caspian Seas and the rugged, mountainous terrain of Anatolia, which we call Asia Minor. And to the south, cradling the entire inner curve of the crescent, is the vast, arid, inhospitable expanse of the Arabian Desert.
So you have this thin sliver of highly livable, fertile land wedged tightly between impassable mountains, deep seas, and a scorching desert.
Which explains exactly why this specific geography matters so much to the story of civilization. It wasn't just a quiet zone of isolated settlement, it was a mandatory zone of transit.
If you wanted to move from Africa to Asia or Europe to the Middle East, you essentially had to walk through this crescent.
Exactly. An endless ebb and flow of people, ideas, and technologies poured through this narrow area. The text aptly describes it as a great crucible of cultures. It was a turmoil of racial and cultural comings and goings for 3,000 to 4,000 years that both constantly enriched and violently disrupted the area.
Okay, let's talk about the specific people doing the coming and going. The dramatis personae, as the text beautifully calls them.
The cast of actors on this early historical stage.
The source text identifies them as primarily belonging to the light-skinned human family, which it notes emerged in Europe and Western Asia. This differentiates them as a regional group of Homo sapiens, alongside African and Asian groups. But because physical remains don't tell us much about their cultures, the text uses linguistic and philological differences to distinguish these migrating groups further.
Now, we absolutely must pause and add a massive historiographical caveat here, which the text itself explicitly states. Most of these older racial and linguistic classifications are highly suspect.
Let's explain why they are suspect for the listener. Because it's really easy to read terms like Semitic race or Indo-European and get the wrong idea completely.
This goes back to the biases of 19th century anthropology. Early historians and linguists realized that certain languages shared common roots. For example, ancient Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit are all related. They called this language family Indo-European, but then they made a massive unscientific leap.
What did they do?
They conflated language with biology. They assumed that everyone who spoke an Indo-European language belonged to a single, uniform genetic race.
Which we now know, thanks to modern genetics, is completely false. A group of people can adopt a new language through trade or conquest without changing their DNA. Language does not equal genetics.
Precisely. So when we use these terms today, we are tracking the movement of language families and cultural groupings, not genetically pure biological races. With that massive caveat in mind, these linguistic groupings do give us a very helpful framework to understand the sheer variety of distinct cultures interacting in this crucible.
Right, it's a cast of characters defined by their tongues. We have the Hamitic language stocks, who evolved in Africa north and northeast of the Sahara. We have the Semitic language speakers, whose historic center of origin was the Arabian Peninsula.
Then you have the peoples of Indo-European language who were spread over a massive area from southern Russia into Europe and down into Iran. And finally, the true Caucasians centered around Georgia in the Caucasus Mountains.
So you have all these distinct linguistic and cultural groups with completely different backgrounds, and their historic homelands are all positioned on the periphery, right around this Fertile Crescent zone where agriculture and wealth are just exploding.
And as the text points out, the sheer wealth of such a well-settled area naturally, inevitably attracted these peripheral peoples.
It's like a prehistoric gold rush. Let's look at the timeline of this collision because it is wild and chaotic. By about 4000 BC, the text says most of the Fertile Crescent was fully occupied by settled farmers.
And Semitic peoples from the desert had likely already begun to penetrate it, moving into the edges of the fertile land. Over the next millennium and a half, their pressure grew steadily.
Okay.
By the middle of the third millennium BC, so around 2500 BC, long after the first civilization had appeared there, they were well established in central Mesopotamia, sitting right across the middle, vital sections of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
And they weren't alone. The text notes a continuing theme of interplay, rivalry, and outright warfare between these Semitic peoples and other groups who managed to hang on to the higher mountainous lands enclosing Mesopotamia from the northeast.
Then, around 2000 BC, a completely new wave arrives. The Indo-European language groups enter the scene in what looks like a massive pincer movement.
Right. The Hittites pushed down into Anatolia from Europe in the west, while the Iranians advanced from the east.
And between 2000 BC and 1500 BC, all these different branches, the Indo-Europeans coming from the north, the Semitic peoples from the south, and the established peoples of the Crescent, they dispute, they conquer, they trade, and they mingle within the Crescent itself. Meanwhile, contacts and conflicts between the Hamitic and Semitic speakers are driving much of the political history of Old Egypt.
The text admits this sweeping scenario is highly impressionistic, but it clearly shows the basic dynamism, the violent rhythm of the region. It was incredibly fluid. But this raises a massive fundamental question for me.
What's that?
What was driving all this mingling, wandering, and disputing? Why couldn't everyone just stay put in their own valleys and speak their own languages?
The overwhelming presumption, according to the deep analysis in our source, is highly surprising to modern ears. The root cause of all this migration was overpopulation.
Okay, here's where I have to push back hard on the text, because I read the numbers it provided, and they kind of broke my brain a little bit.
Let's hear the numbers.
In 4000 BC, at the start of all this chaotic movement, the text estimates the entire global population was roughly 80 to 90 million people. To put that in perspective, as the author helpfully notes, that is about the size of modern-day Germany.
The entire human race, scattered across the entire globe, could fit inside the borders of one modern European country.
Right, and over the next 4,000 years, that global population grew by about 50%, reaching roughly 130 million. Now, a 50% increase spread over 4,000 years implies an annual growth rate that is, as the text admits, almost imperceptible by comparison with what we now take for granted.
Extremely slow.
So my question, and I'm sure the listener's question, is how on earth can you have an entire planet with the population of modern Germany with a growth rate so slow you wouldn't notice it in a lifetime and be suffering from overpopulation? It sounds like an absolute paradox. There was so much empty land.
It does seem completely paradoxical, but that is because we are thinking about overpopulation in modern 21st century terms. When we hear overpopulation, we think of a lack of physical space. We picture traffic jams, crowded subway cars, and sprawling megacities.
Exactly.
But that is not what overpopulation meant in 4000 BC.
So what did it actually mean to them?
It is entirely about what the text calls the fragile margin of resources. Overpopulation, in the ancient context, has nothing to do with square footage. It is entirely about a specific, localized area's capacity to feed its people at a given primitive technological level.
So it doesn't matter if there are thousands of miles of empty, beautiful grassland right next door, if you don't have the technology to farm it, or if it doesn't have a reliable water source.
Exactly. You are tethered to the oasis. You are tethered to the river valley. The text emphasizes that human growth was slight by later standards, precisely because it was always based on this incredibly fragile margin. And this brings us all the way back to our very first point about the climatic setting.
Right, the climate had broadly stabilized globally, ending the Ice Age. But we noted there were still short-term local fluctuations.
And because ancient agriculture was so primitive, relying entirely on the natural flooding of rivers or seasonal rains, those minor local climatic changes were utterly devastating. A single dry year, catastrophic out-of-season storms, or even just a few decades of marginally lower or higher average temperatures could suddenly and dramatically destroy a specific valley's capacity to feed itself.
If the temperature drops 2 degrees, your wheat just doesn't grow. And in a time long before global supply chains, long before refrigeration or cargo ships, you couldn't just import grain from another continent if your crops failed.
You faced a brutal binary choice: starve to death or move.
So the immediate result was often famine. But the text argues that in the longer run, there were other, far more important results for the trajectory of the human race.
This is the ultimate synthesis of our entire deep dive today. These climatic disruptions, these local failures, and the fragile margin of resources were the ultimate prime movers of early history.
Climatic change acting as an invisible determinant, forcing people to get on the move.
By destroying local food supplies, the shifting climate forced peoples of entirely different linguistic traditions, different technologies, and different worldviews to abandon their isolated homes and migrate in search of water and food. They poured out of the drying deserts and the cooling steppes. They flooded into the only places that still had reliable food, which were geographic choke points like the Fertile Crescent.
And when they arrived, desperate and starving, they collided with the people already living there.
In collision, they disputed. They fought brutal wars over the remaining fertile land, but over centuries, they also cooperated. They traded. They intermarried. The Indo-European speaker learned irrigation from the Semitic speaker,
which exponentially increased the total potential, the complexity of their societies.
Precisely. This forced interaction, driven entirely by the threat of starvation, is what generated that critical mass of complexity we talked about at the very beginning. The pressure cooker of migration and collision is what accelerated civilization itself.
Wow. So to summarize this incredibly dense, fascinating journey for you listening, we've learned that civilization isn't just about passing a physical checklist. It isn't just about having massive stone walls or a big population. Sorry again, Jericho.
Jericho really got a raw deal there.
It did. True civilization requires a critical mass of complexity, a self-sustaining engine of specialized variety that was largely birthed in the dense, resource reallocating, surplus-driven environment of cities.
We also learned that this spark didn't just happen once in a stroke of genius and spread like a rumor. The 19th century diffusion myth is dead, completely shattered by radiocarbon dating and the isolated brilliance of the Mesoamericans.
It's true.
Civilization arose independently in at least 7 different places, utilizing vastly different technologies and facing completely different environments, driven by the unique human capacity to rise to local challenges.
And ironically, beautifully, this civilized process didn't unify humanity. It did the exact opposite. It made us fundamentally, radically different from one another, generating wildly alternative models of society, from rigid Egypt to fluid Crete, whose inner presuppositions and coordinates of time and value are almost impossible for us to fully grasp today without falling into the trap of anachronism.
And finally, all of this dynamic change, all this mingling and migrating in crucibles like the Fertile Crescent, was not driven by human confidence, but by vulnerability. It was ultimately driven by the harsh realities of localized overpopulation on a mostly empty planet. It was the terrifying fragility of the food supply in the face of minor climatic shifts that forced humanity to collide, to fight, and ultimately to cooperate.
Which brings us to a final, very provocative thought to leave you with today.
We in the modern world often think of human civilization, our sprawling cities, our advanced technologies, our global supply networks, as our ultimate shield against the unpredictability of nature. We think we have conquered the climate. But looking at the very birth of civilized life, the exact opposite is true. It wasn't our mastery over nature that pushed us forward. It was our intense, desperate vulnerability to it. If a slight localized shift in temperature, a minor drought, is what drove the desperate migrations that eventually forced humans to build the incredibly complex ancient world, what kind of totally new, unrecognizable societal models might our current global era of massive climate shifts force us to build?
It really makes you look at that murky, ambiguous X-ray of our historical origins a whole lot differently, doesn't it? Suddenly, the muddy waters aren't just a problem with our historical vision. They are the very substance from which we were molded. The chaos, the collision, the fragility, the desperate need to survive a changing climate. That is the actual definitive diagnosis of civilization. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep questioning the unquestionable foundations of the world around you, and we'll see you next time.